Year 10 and 11, welcome to your revision of the poem War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy in preparation for your AQA English Literature Poetry exam. War Photographer. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. He has a job to do. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands which did not tremble then, though seem to now. Rural England. Home again to ordinary pain which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 for Sunday's supplement. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. From the aeroplane he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. Carol Ann Duffy was inspired to write this poem by her friendship with a war photographer. She was especially intrigued by the challenge faced by these photographers whose job requires them to record terrible and horrific events without being able to directly help the subjects. Throughout the poem, Duffy provokes us to consider our own response when confronted with the photographs that we regularly see in newspapers, and why so many of us have become desensitised to these images. By viewing this issue from the perspective of the photographer, she also reveals the difficulties of such an occupation. By the end of the poem, it is clear her subject straddles 2 vastly different worlds, yet increasingly feels he belongs to neither. Okay, your summing up of the poem before we analyse structure and language in more detail. Okay, so throughout the poem War Photographer, Carol Ann Duffy casts a harsh light on the destruction and bloodshed which results from war, and how apathetic and uncaring the rest of the world is because they are not directly affected. Okay, the poem itself. The poem starts with a description of the war photographer standing alone in his dark room. All the photos that he has taken of the war are contained within the rolls which are organised into neat rows, making him feel like a priest who is about to lead a mass funeral. He then considers all of the places he has been, places which has been torn apart by war. Remember this, places such as Beirut and Phnom Penh. He also remembers all of the bloodshed he has witnessed. He feels that everything has to, in the end, die and return to earth. He carries on with his work, but the ironic fact is that he who wasn't afraid whilst in the middle of gunfire and death now trembles in the safety of his own home, rural England, where the most troubling thing is the constantly changing weather, and where he does not have to worry about the ground blowing up beneath his feet. Okay, when we get to the third stanza, it starts off mysteriously as the half-developed photographs are described. The vague features of the man seem to be the photographer, like the spirit of the soldier, and he remembers the moment when he took the picture. He remembers the hopeless screaming of the soldier's wife as he had silently sought her permission to take her dying husband's photograph, and he remembers clearly how the blood from his wound had seeped into the earth. And then the final stanza takes on a detached tone, as the photographer thinks of how, from the hundreds of photos he has taken, each telling its own awful story of agony and pain, his editor will randomly select a handful to put in the newspaper. He knows that the people back home will glance at them in the afternoon and feel sorrow for a fleeting second, but then they will move on with their lives. By the end of the poem, even he shrugs off all feelings towards his work and looks upon the war-torn land from his high altitude in the plain, where such suffering happens on a day-to-day basis, and the world doesn't care. Okay, the structure of the poem. The poem is laid out in 4 regular 6-line stanzas, with each stanza ending in a rhyming couplet. This structure is rigid and strict, and that reflects the life of a soldier. You know, soldiers follow strict military routines, so the structure of the poem reflects that. But also, this very rigid order actually contrasts with the disturbing images that we have described throughout the poem. Also, the organisation of the poem mirrors the actions of the war photographer himself, who lays out his films in ordered rows. It's almost as if he thinks he is helping to restore order in a world of chaos, or in a situation of chaos, i.e. war, when things are out of your control. This is where he regains control, if you like. Remember, poetry is all about interpretation, so as long as you've got something to say that is appropriate to the meaning and themes of the poem, then write it down. Some people think that the stanzas being so rigid and so strict and almost very much the same shape, that they are like supposed to be the photographs. So each stanza represents a different photograph that he is taken, if you like. The style is very clinical and matter of fact, perhaps to imitate the clinical approach required by people in this job of where you're under extreme pressure, and you've got to be detached. You can't be too emotive in these situations, otherwise you probably wouldn't get the job done. And that is very much in contrast with the readers of the newspaper, where he thinks there's a distance. You know, they'll read the paper and feel sad for a fleeting second, but move on. The poem is focused on images of human suffering, and Duffy concentrates on the sense of sight throughout the poem, which is why the poem is full of imagery, which we'll come to in the language bit in a moment. So just to recap your structure: 4 regular rigid stanzas to contrast with the chaos of what's going on around the photographer. It represents the ordered rows. It represents the military lifestyle. For the rhyming couplet, again, that is where interpretation comes in. Why does each stanza end with the rhyming couplet? Is it to show us the contrasting emotions, the detached viewer, the detached reader of the paper, and those involved in the war, who obviously are extremely emotive because of the situation they're in? Is it the fact that he has to be clinical when he's doing his job, but when he returns home, he's emotional? So think about why we end with the rhyming couplet. Why has Duffy done that? What does it signify? Is it, is the rhyming couplet almost like a summing up of the death and destruction that he's had to witness, and then his return home, where his editor coldly chooses the pictures that need to be seen? All right. Stanza 1 of the poem. We'll analyse that in a little bit more detail. So the poem opens in an intimate, tranquil setting of the photographer's dark room. He is compared to a priest, and therefore there's a definite sense of ritual in the way that he develops the film. We hear of spools of suffering and ordered rows, which I'll come back to, massive metaphor, perhaps in an attempt to restore order to the chaos around him. He handles the pictures with the same respect with which a priest would prepare for communion. So we have a spiritual link there. The religious imagery is effective in not only conveying the dedication the photographer feels towards his job, but also, like a priest, he is often exposed to death and suffering. Okay. The red light of the dark room has connotations of the light that burns in Catholic churches to symbolise the presence of Christ. But as we know, the colour red, massive connotations of blood and death, which is a sight that the priest and the photographer are familiar with. The red light is also a function in the photographer's room, helping him to process the images. There's a suggestion that this dark room where he is alone, okay, so the word alone there suggests that it's a place of sanctuary for him, a place of safety, where he can take some kind of solace in what he's just experienced and the work he's done, and just I suppose have some private time, if you like, especially if he's just been in the middle of a war zone. So he develops the images of war, as we know, and we're going to go into a lot of depth now. So if we start with the first line, in his dark room he is finally alone. If we look at the pronoun his, okay, earlier on I was talking about how the poem has this element of detachment. Now, as a reader reading the paper, at the end of the poem we are detached. We read the paper, we look at the pictures, and then we move on. We don't feel what the photographer wants us to feel, what the photographer feels, or what the soldiers feel. So this pronoun sets up that detachment as well for us from the photographer, because it is very difficult for us to understand what he has gone through and understand what he has experienced. So the pronoun his sets up that detachment. Pronoun he as well. So there's two pronouns there. All right. He is finally alone. If we look at the adverb finally, it's almost relief. It's, as I've just said, a place of solace, and it's his sanctuary. And that adverb almost sounds like desperation, that he is finally alone to look at the horror that he has witnessed and experienced. The metaphor with spools of suffering, as I said before, big metaphor, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. Not only is it metaphorical, but you've got the alliteration of the S's there. And I think that makes the suffering, I know this sounds silly, but it makes the suffering more permanent, more memorable. We can't forget it, much like the photographer can't forget the images that he has taken. The spools of suffering, if we look at that word spools, again, it's linked to chaos, but it's also a vast amount. So it's basically every image he has taken is one of pain and suffering, and it's set out in ordered rows. We did look at that earlier when we done structure. It's the idea that he feels he can restore some order to the chaos he's witnessed, or to the chaos of the world, or it's the moment he feels he's back in control, because obviously during the war zone he certainly fell out of control. The only light is red and softly glows. We've done the colour red and the connotations that has, but we'll just reiterate it there. Obviously, the adjective red we know has connotations of blood, connotations of death, which is obviously what he has witnessed. Again, the link there is that the colour red is used in the red light that you use in processing these pictures, okay? And it says it softly glows. Again, look at that adverb, softly. It's almost ironic, because the bloodshed he's witnessed, there's nothing soft about it. It's well, indescribable, I suppose. As though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Obviously, I described the priest in detail earlier. So if you need to rewind the video and listen to that, that's fine. Then we get this single word, isn't it? Like places, sentences. So we've got Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. It's a list, isn't it? It's a quick list of all the places he's been, all the places he's witnessed the suffering and the death. Now, the significance of naming these places, if we're doing terminology, we should know that places are nouns. Is that what happens for the reader there is we realise that war, conflict, death, destruction is happening all over the world, and I think that that is one of the saddest moments in the poem, if you like. That it's almost as if war was unavoidable. All flesh is grass. Again, metaphorical. Think about what your interpretation is there, but I did say earlier that it's this spiritual, religious idea that we return to the earth when we're dead. But if you have a different interpretation for that metaphor, again, go with it. All flesh is grass. I don't know. Could you argue that war, is happens so often now that not natural, but it is happened to all too often, and it's almost something that is natural to human beings, much like obviously grass is is natural. I don't know, remember, it's interpretation, so think about why all flesh is grass there. Okay, if we have a look at stanza 2 now in a little bit more detail, I'll just do a quick almost sum it up and then we'll go in depth with language. So, stanza 2 breaks the calmness of the dark room with the line, he has a job to do. That short, simple sentence breaks that calmness, okay? And it brings us back to this clinical idea that he has to take the pictures and develop the pictures. The phrase solutions slop in trays has a double meaning, okay? Because it refers directly to the onomatopoeic sound of the chemicals he is using to develop the pictures, but also the hope that in some way these photographs may help to contribute to the resolution of the conflicts that they show. Okay, solutions slop in trays beneath his hands. Significantly, the photographer's hands are shaking throughout. As we can see, it says that they did not tremble then, though seem to now. And there's a massive irony in there that he wasn't trembling and he wasn't shaking and he wasn't scared during the actual conflict. But he is now when he looks at the pictures. So the implication is that in order to function and do his job properly in a war zone, he must distance himself from the soldiers or the people he has taken photographs of. And that there links to the distance that the reader feels through the pronouns we hear in the poem. And at the end, when we hear that the reader almost doesn't care about the pictures they witness in the paper. However, obviously, when he returns to the dark room to look at the photos, he lets his guard down and he reacts. And when he reacts and truly witnesses the photographs that he's taken, he suffers and he trembles. All right, tremble, emotive language. Naturally, we probably would expect him to tremble when he sees what he sees. Again, irony there being that when the readers of the paper look at the photos, they don't flinch, they don't tremble, because as you know, it's that idea that, well, as long as it's not affecting us, everything's fine. He considers the contrast between rural England, so we hear that short sentence there again, very, very quick. The war and the war zones that he visits, noting how our ordinary pain and problems can be dispelled by the weather. Home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. The injustice of the situation is further promoted when he notes how our children don't have to be fearful of landmines when they play. So what we have here is when he returns home to ordinary pain. I mean, look at that adjective, ordinary. It's terrifying, isn't it? The idea that the pain we feel does not even match the pain of the soldiers and the pain of the soldiers' families. That and the idea that our pain can be taken away through something as simple and God naive as the weather. And in that respect, the reader almost feels selfish. And then we hear, obviously, as I say, about the fields that aren't going to explode underneath our feet. The poet Caroline Duffy here almost suggests that we take our country, our amenities, our life for granted there, that we can play outside in peace. Whereas in other countries, that is a luxury that they can't, that they don't have. All right. Don't forget, as I said, the sentence that takes the calmness away there is he has a job to do. And that brings us back to the war photographer. We try to take his perspective there, which is very difficult for us to imagine, but he does have a job to do at the end of the day. The solutions that slop in trays, listen to that alliteration again, beneath his hands. The verb slops, it's messy. It reminds us of the chaos of what he's witnessed and how he's trying to put that right in his own way. Massive emotive word, don't forget, was tremble. and emotive language in terms of children and nightmare. All right, all those emotive words show us exactly what the pictures are depicting, but also the feelings of the war photographer. On to stanza 3, we're nearly there. Don't forget you can pause this video as you need. I know sometimes I talk really fast, so pause it, rewind it if it's useful to make notes. Stanza 3, the opening line, something is happening, injects drama and suspense into the poem, and it suggests that the photographer is not solely in control of the development process. Something is happening. It doesn't even sound specific, really. And then Duffy allows us, the reader, to see the horrendous photograph develop before our eyes, and this is where she uses imagery massively. Okay, so here we go. In it, the photographer has captured the image of a man in his dying moments, and he is described as a half-formed ghost. So everybody got that? Okay, just underline it there. Right, now if we go back up, something is happening, we've done that sentence, massive drama, quick paced sentence. What is it that's happening? It makes the reader think. There's loads of suspense there. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. We've got the alliteration of the F's there again. If we just look at the word stranger, again, it's that idea of detachment. It's a stranger. We don't know who it is. Then the rhetorical question starts to build in the sense of, do we care if it's a stranger? Which will bring us back to stanza 4. Looking at the newspaper pictures, do we care? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. All right, so a stranger's features faintly twist. Don't forget as well, the stranger, remember the photographer has had to remain detached from the people he's taken images of. So that again shows you the detachment he forces himself to feel when in the war zone, when in the conflict. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. Now again, look at twist. Look at that verb. It's uncomfortable. It's like the other uncomfortable words we've had, like spools. All right. It also, to me, and again, this is my interpretation, reminds me of something painful. It twists before his eyes. It suggests something uncomfortable. So pain for the person that's dying, uncomfortable for the photographer, uncomfortable for us witnessing it develop. A half-formed ghost. As I say, the man is dying. He's took a picture, the man is dying. Ghost kind of sums that up for us, all right? Half-formed, why? Because the photograph is starting to develop. We're starting to see this person. The description is effective in 2 ways, because it describes the way the figure is gradually appearing on the page, whilst also alluding to the fact that since he no longer exists, he is effectively called the ghost, okay? Which is obviously what I was just trying to say, right? Now, the photographer then recalls how, unable to speak the same language, he's had to get approval through looking at the soldier's wife. So we hear, he remembers the cries of this man's wife. Emotive language, as we know, is big in this poem. Cries of this man's wife. How he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. All right. So, as I say, looks at the wife for approval. The image of the priest at the beginning is effective here because, like the photographer, a priest will tend to people in their final moments. The impact of this memory on the war photographer and his sensitivity in seeking the permission is a very intimate moment that we are being presented with. So how he sought approval without words to do what someone must. How the blood stained into foreign dust. Again, metaphor. How the blood stained into foreign dust. Think about interpretation there. the blood stained into foreign dust. Now, when I think of stained, it's something you can't remove. So it's not only the memory of this woman losing her husband, it is the image the photographer has taken that he won't forget. It is the image that us as a reader are presented with. It also is the idea that, in terms of stain, something that can't be removed, war, it's unforgettable. Okay, and when we hear what someone must, again, it's this idea that it is his job. He's aware of how intrusive he's been, but he tries his best to be compassionate towards the woman, if you like. Okay? And finally, okay, stanza 4. As the poet begins to reach her conclusion, she makes a comment on the way these images are received by the people they are produced for. So that is both the editor of the newspaper and the readers, okay? Now we hear straight away 100 agonies in black and white, metaphor obviously. And again, we've got our emotive language in the word agonies, because we realise that each image is full of something painful. The number 100 is a big number, isn't it? It's a massive number, especially if if you laid out 100 pictures of pain, there would be a lot of pictures in front of you. The chances are he's probably taken more than 100, but the number's massive. So we realise that he's taken hundreds and hundreds of pictures and only 5 or 6 are picked, right? So the 100 agonies the photographer has selected for his editor, it contrasts with the 5 or 6 that are picked out. There's a massive contrast in the numbers there. The careless indifference in the way the editor selects the images reinforces how little regard he has for the people in the pictures, for the soldiers in the pictures. Remember what I said earlier, he probably just picks them out randomly, with no regard, no care. Again, that links us back to that idea of detachment. Duffy extends this response to us through the reader. So the reader of the newspaper, she says, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. All right. So, as I said before, there is a fleeting second, and we have that metaphor, the reader's eyeballs prick with tears, where we feel upset. We feel upset and affected by the picture, but it'll pass because we're going to go and have a beer. So it's the idea, once again, that we don't care, and that is why the poem is powerful in the sense that it finishes with that line. So if we go to the finish, the poem ends with the photographer departing once more for a new job. His sense of separation from his countrymen is evident as he refers to us as they. Okay, he says they do not care. I said stanza 1 how important pronoun is. We have the pronoun of he, it's detached, it's almost impersonal. Then we have the pronoun of they, and then we see that he feels detached from us and doesn't have that personal connection to us. Okay? So as I say, pronouns in this poem are I think, quite forceful. I'm carrying on. As he surveys the landscape, because he's in the plain looking over of rural England, there is a growing acceptance that despite his best efforts, his photographs will make no difference. Okay, so from the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living and they do not care. So again, the detachment, he's up in the plane looking down on England, and there's this idea that he can't connect to the reader through the pronoun they, and I think it's massive that the poem finishes with they do not care, because it is this idea that we very quickly look at these massive images on a day-to-day basis in the news, and it doesn't really affect us that much, and I suppose that is where the poem holds a massive theme of sadness. if we just do one final summing up of Duffy's literary devices, and then we'll be finished, okay? So she uses, obviously, a number of literary devices to express the horror of war. The metaphor, spools of suffering, and the alliteration of the S obviously shows us the photographs and the the massive meaning that they carry in terms of, when you look at them, the effect they will have, especially on the photographer, remember, because he begins to tremble. There's a contrast in how he has organised suffering, the chaos of pain and war, ordered in rows. It's a metaphor again, comparing possibly the rows of coffins of the dead soldiers, to the pictures, if you like. We've done the red light. The red light is symbolic of the bloodshed that the photographer has witnessed. It reminds him of the church, of the priest preparing for the funeral. If we link that again to the image of blood stained into foreign dust, that almost links into all flesh is grass. Those metaphors portray a few different ideas to the reader in terms of death and bloodshed. Duffy uses ambiguity in a couple of places to portray different ideas to the reader. In the third stanza, the half-developed picture is described as a half-formed ghost, either implying that the image is vague and faint, or the fact that the photograph shows a dead man whose spirit is somehow shown through the photograph. The fourth stanza describes the photographs in black and white. This could mean both that the pictures are monochrome and without colour, or a contrast between good and evil, life and death. The poem is an effective comment on society because it shows the agonies of war and the apathy of mankind towards it. All right. The persona of the war photographer is most apt as he is between these two realities. On one side, he experiences a world which is torn apart by war, where innocent children die because of minefields. And on the other side, there is the rest of the world, which is full of people who do not have time in their busy lives to care about matters which do not directly affect them. Okay, he is therefore in such a state to compare these two worlds, and he at first feels disgust towards the uncaring world, and guilt at being the one to exploit the suffering of the dying soldiers. But then he takes on an impassive attitude, knowing that no matter how he feels, he cannot change the world, nor stop war or bloodshed. All he can do is his job, which he does. Okay? I hope this was useful. Don't forget you can stop it and go back. I know sometimes I do talk quick. Make notes as you see fit. Look at the notes on structure, the rigid structure, the rhyming couplets, the regular stanza lengths. Look at the images, the metaphor, the pronouns. Okay, thank you.